Let's do an argument autopsy and see why we argue and what we can do to agree more often. As an example, let's use purple and orange. Purple says, "Did you hear that Trump is like Charles Manson?" Orange just thinks that's the stupidest thing to say. Now, if you asked Orange, how stupid is that? Maybe put it in a percentage. Orange would probably say 40%. You know, Trump might have some things in common with Charles Manson, but nothing. It doesn't make him a serial killer. Now, if you ask Purple, Purple would probably say 60%. You know, I don't put a lot of stock into this, but it sounds like something funny and probably bother Orange, so I'll go ahead and say it. But, you know, it could be true. Purple then says he uses simple statements like build a wall and lock her up. And Orange thinks that's a stupid excuse. 20%. Well, a lot of people use short phrases like that. And what's worse is that when he hears that that's the excuse that Purple's giving, he actually lowers his estimate of the main statement from 40% down to 30%. And Orange says, isn't hope and change the same thing as build a wall? Now, Purple gives that one a 20% because hope and change was just a slogan, but Obama's speeches were more complex, and Trump's build a wall was the main part of his speech, in Purple's mind at least. So when Purple hears that, he increases his confidence because now he's gone past a complaint by someone else and doesn't believe it. So he's increasing. So you can see these two people moving further and further apart in their assessment and their scoring of this argument. Instead of countering the hope and change statement, he just piles on more reasons why Trump is like Charles Manson. And of course, Orange listens to all those, and silently in Orange's mind, Orange gives them different ratings. And with all these not so good statements by Purple, Orange then lowers his overall rating of the main statement from 30% down to 10%. So you can see they're moving further and further away the more facts they add to the case. So why are we disagreeing? Even with the same information, we disagree. One reason is they ignore your points. That's based on confirmation bias. So as Orange heard statements from Purple and vice versa, they dismissed them because they didn't match what they already believed. This is just a natural way people think. They also forget your points. When Purple was putting all those points out, Orange would most likely forget a few or just dismiss them completely. And people only have a working limit of about 7 items. So if you get past that, which most of these debates we have these days are, then it's unlikely that the other person will be able to remember all your points and correctly analyze them. And people just make arbitrary judgments. They use heuristics. This is just the way the human brain works in general. We can be more algorithmic and more logical, but it's not our natural state. And it's very difficult. So how would an app help? Let's do an analogy, and let's take a situation where you have about $100 worth of groceries and some coupons in your grocery store, and you go up to the counter, and the clerk says that'll be $200, and you look down at your stuff and you think, can I see the receipt? So you ask the clerk for the receipt, and the clerk comes back and says, we don't have receipts. This grocery store, the way they do it is the clerk knows the prices of all the items in the store. They look down at it, and they quickly tally it up in their mind, and they tell you what to pay. And you're like, what? That does not seem very trustworthy. So the question is, why do we like receipts? Receipts are documented. You don't have to remember anything or everything. They're structured, easy to understand. They're listed in rows and columns. And the judgment is by math. They show their work. You can check it. You can pull out a calculator and double check it if you don't trust the adding machine. But, you know, you're going to trust the cash register a lot more than you do the actual person ringing you up. Just because computers are better at numbers. So how can we get this done in a web app? The web app would document everything so they can't forget or dismiss any statements you make. It would be structured, so instead of just large paragraphs and prose, you'd show each statement in its context. And it would use judgments by math. So it uses math to score each judgment based on the information in the system so far and its position. So you don't have to do the math in your head, which we naturally do, although we don't do it mathematically, we do it heuristically, but it's the same result. So what is this reason score is the app we're talking about? Let's talk about what it is not, just because these are some things that people tend to get confused on. It's not a popularity contest, so there is no voting in the system whatsoever. It's not perfect. This is just an experiment. We're seeing where it'll go and improve on it, so don't expect perfect. It's just in beta. And there's no artificial intelligence in the system now. We might look at that in the future, but that's not needed for the core system to work. And it's not absolute truth. It can only score based on the information provided it, which is basically how we work too. Okay, so let's go into a demo. Let's take a look at how reasonableness is scored. Imagine you have a friend that's working at a startup. He's under a non-disclosure agreement, so he can't tell you anything about the startup, including its name or what it does, but they do need to see whether or not they're going to take this controversial action. They've been debating it in there, and he needs your help making the decision. Now, he can't tell you any of the actual reasons why they should or should not take that action, but he can tell you how many they are, how valid they are, how important they are, and if any of those reasons have reasons beneath it to explain why they should or should not do it. But it needs you to kind of give him an idea of how reasonable it would be to take this action. So let's say he starts out and he says, well, right now we've been debating it, and there's one reason for taking this controversial action, and there's one reason against. So in this case, the purple reasons are reasons for, and the orange reasons are reasons against. Now, he asks you, so, giving me a percentage, well, how reasonable would it be for us to take this action? Saying 0% would be definitely shouldn't, 100% definitely should, and 50% would be, undecided. So what score would you give it if there's one reason for, one reason against, and they're both the same importance and the same validity? Well, probably give it around 50%. There's reasons for, reasons against, but there's no determining what you should do. Now he says, okay, well, we were talking a little bit more, and we have an additional reason to do it that's just as valid and just as important as the other reasons. So we add that into the system. Now, what do you think the reasonableness score would be? What score would you give your friend based on this little information? Probably give a 67%, right? 2 reasons for and 1 reason against. So, about what there's a 1/3 reason not to or a 2/3 reason to. And if we can, if we want to look at the weights of each of these individual things, we can see that they all have a weight of 1. So you have 3 items in there, 2 for, 1 against. Now, imagine that he found another reason on why it why they should take the controversial action. What would you expect that reasonable score to do? Would it go up or down? And if it went up, by how much? Let's take a look and find out. So we add another pro reason, and yep, it goes up to 75%. You have 4 reasons in the list. 1 of them is to not do it. 3 of them are to do it, so 75%. So that all makes sense right away. Now let's say he says, let's go down to that very, very first reason that he gave us, and let's say we found a reason for that reason to be incorrect. So we're going to, underneath this bottom reason down here, we're going to add a child to it that says a reason why that reason is false. So it'll be an orange reason. And you can see that what it does is it makes its weight 0 because it's been proven false. So it shouldn't have an effect. So now we have these other reasons. Now the weight on these go up as we add more descendant reasons. The weights kind of go up more and more to give you an idea of how many reasons there are beneath them. But we can go into more detail on that. But for now, let's just see that they're all equal, and they're all 2s. So this one is now a 0. So if we just kind of look at the ones there, you can see there's 3 that really have weights, and so now we're down back to the 67% because there's 2 for and 1 against. Now we could also come back, and for this reason, we can come back and say, well, there is a reason for it to be true, so let's give it a reason to be true. And you know what? There's actually 2 reasons for it to be true. Let's add 2 in there. So now it has a weight of 1. These other ones have a weight of 3. So now instead of going back up to 75%, it just goes up to 70%. So you can see this one isn't quite as valid or as important as all the other reasons. So it has less of a weight. And now we can see, and if someone comes in looking at this later, they can look at this reason and say, oh, okay, I agree with that, I agree with that, I agree with that. Oh, but this one, that one's too low, or maybe this one's too high, and then they can inspect and see why they are high or low, and they can scroll through the information and add pros or con reasons as they needed, and the system will keep the score. So instead of each of us calculating this score in our own head, adding our own weights and our own importance that we don't discuss, instead of leaving all that out or dismissing each other's points, the system forces us to justify anytime we want to change the score by putting in a reason, and that blocks out a lot of that, makes our actions more rational. So we actually have to explain why we believe something is more or less reasonable. Thank you, and I'd love your feedback.